Hello and welcome to another update. In this one I'll be covering the latest updates and developments from the front line. Starting out in the Zaporizhzhia front to the south of Odehiv, the Ukrainians have launched another armored attack in the direction of the Russian forces. Here they pushed with another armored attack through the south of Odehiv towards Robotine, but they have so far been unable to break through, and they were pushed back by the Russian forces, and they have since then retreated as they have been unable to break through. According to the updates, the Ukrainian forces tried launching an attack, they advanced a bit, and then they went to the forest lines after heavy artillery shelling by the Russian forces, which forced them to abandon any idea of a breakthrough as they lost 2 tanks. And since then they went to the sides, dismounted their vehicles, and the soldiers have stuck to the forest lines since then. And since then there's been no updates on this part of the front line. Then we move on to the northern parts by the Remelsky village, where here there was an update by Deep State Map which clarified that the Russian forces still have control over this area here to the northeast of Priotne, which would explain why the Ukrainian forces have been unable to capture it so far, as they've managed to break through the Russian defenders by the river line here to the northwest. But since they do not have the eastern part, they cannot fully engage in the battles by Priotne. They need to fight on this eastern part first before that they're able to push on to the village. Otherwise, the Russian forces can just close their flanks by pushing through from the east to the west. And other than that, there's been a lot of fighting here, especially by Seremeyoske, where here with the river lines to the right side, the Ukrainian forces are heavily attacking from the left side, which allows them to have the advantage in the sense that the Russian forces are concentrated in one area and the Ukrainian forces can attack from multiple directions, which allow them to concentrate the artillery in one area, while the Russian forces have to attack multiple areas. This leaves Ukraine with an advantage here. Then we move on to the western part of the Zaporizhzhia front, where here by Beachhead, the Ukrainian forces have managed to capture the forest patch here to the west of the village, which allows them to now attack Serbianki from the both northern and eastern parts of the front line. And that is all for the Zaporizhzhia front. Then we move on to the area to the south of Avdiivka, north of Marinka, where here there is this outpost by the Ukrainian forces, and the Russian forces have managed to capture it following this video here. And as we can see, the Russian forces have managed to capture this area, which has a few trenches, but it's not as heavily defended as other areas. But from the destruction we see in the video that the fortifications are all destroyed. Essentially, there's nothing but rubble. And although there are some trenches here, the Russian forces have still managed to take control over the area. And to point out the hypocrisy of the media, especially the Western media, there was a lot of articles about the time where the Ukrainian forces managed to take control over this area right here. And it is just so stupid because this was an area that hasn't moved since 2014. So they were saying the Ukrainian forces have managed to capture territory that hasn't moved since 2014, as if it is a huge step in the right direction. The Ukrainians are making major advances and all of that stuff. But in reality, it's just a gray zone in between a trench network controlled by the Ukrainian forces and a trench network controlled by the Russian forces. And then if we take a closer look, we can actually see that there are 2 stages of trench networks. There's the forward position on both sides, and then there's the backward position on both sides. So this is the forward and backward position of the Russian forces. Then we have the forward position of the Ukrainian forces, and the backward position is even further back, right here, right there. As we can see, there are some trenches here. So essentially, both sides have forward and backward positions, and this is some sort of gray zone, no man's land, where there's essentially no one there. There's just destruction and a lot of artillery being shelled on both sides. We can look at these satellite images. There's a lot of holes everywhere, and this is from the 8-year-long war between the Donbass and Ukraine. And from this, we can see that this is territory that hasn't been touched since 2014. Yes, but it's completely meaningless unless they actually break through one of these trench areas. And in comparison, we now see the Russian forces advance a couple of kilometers and take control over an outpost that flanks these positions As we mentioned, is a forward and a backward position. This area here flanks, this outpost here flanks both of these trenches and can essentially go around them, which would make this whole area completely meaningless. And then we'll now not see any Western media talk about this because they ignore all of the Russian successes and report only on Ukrainian successes, which is why we're getting this echo chamber warp mindset from both sides. And to everyone who says, okay, I'm pro-Russian for saying this, well, essentially, I reported on this as well. I reported when it happened, and I also report on this when this happens. So I'm saying the successes and failures of both sides, just like I reported on the failure of the Russian offensive in Uledar. I also reported on the failure of the Russian offensive west of Kamyanka, and I'm also reporting on the failures of the Ukrainian offensives both in Bakhmut and in the Zaporizhia front. There's a lot of news happening, and I report on everything I think is relevant for the procedure of this battle. And so a lot of people are complaining, well, what about the Crimea Bridge? The Ukrainians managed to attack it, and I said it's completely useless. I said it was a failure, both a success and a failure. A success because they actually managed to hit it, and a failure because they only managed to damage some roads. The most important part, which is the railways, have not been touched. They are essentially moving as scheduled. No, not even any delays other than the fact they had to stop it for a couple of hours. And then United States Strategic Communications Coordinator John Kirby says, we did not see any impact of the strike on the bridge on the alignment of forces and means of Russia and its military potential in Crimea or in southern Ukraine. So he is saying with these sugared, sweet words that it was a failure. They have no impact on the war, just like I said. So in the end, I report on the truth, and I report and try to be as honest as possible when I come with these reports. And the reason why I focus on the hypocrisy of the Western media and not the Russian media is, one, because I'm from Europe and I do not speak Russian, which means that the media I'm exposed to is Western media, not Russian media, and two, because the West has banned most Russian media outlets that report in English, which means, again, I cannot go and find Russian reports. The closest I get to that is through Telegram, and there they do analysis of those, so they are already talking shit about the Russian media. So I cannot add anything to that. But what I can do is look at Western media because I speak English and I know English, and that is what I'm exposed to. That's why I point out the hypocrisy, not because of any other reason. So in the end, it's what I have available, not my bias. Moving on, we have interesting updates coming from the Luhansk-Kharkiv area. First off, by the south of Kuzymivka, in the area in between Kuzymivka and Svatove, between Svatove and Kreminna, we see that the Russian forces have managed to pass through the Serebets River, which is here west of Kuzymivka, managed to capture this forest patch, and now have a beachhead across the river line. This means that they are now in a position where they can transfer troops and equipment across the river line. So why is this actually important? This is in regards to something that I've been talking about for a long time now. Looking at the Russian forces that are concentrated in this part of the front line, we have two very important ones. The first is the 4th Guards Tank Division, then we have the 19th Tank Division. These two combined actually gather up a large amount of forces, especially armored personnel in this part of the front line. And my estimate on the 13th of June, which was over a month ago, was that the Russian forces here would exceed 800 tanks concentrated in this part of the front line with the necessary manpower according to that. Then we have recent reports from Ukrainian commanders in this part of the front line that say that the Russian forces have concentrated over 900 tanks and 100,000 military personnel in this part of the front line, which spans from the Kharkiv area and all the way down south to Kreminna. So this part has 100,000 personnel and over 900 tanks. This is a large amount of forces, and 900 tanks is a big enough force to launch an offensive operation in this part of the front line. So this is why this small beachhead across the river line here in the Svatove Krim in the front is important, because this could be a prelude to a possible offensive on this part of the front line. The question here is, how well do they have it? How much of the area is actually guarded and weaponized by the Ukrainian forces? Are they able to push them back and all of these things? But if they manage to hold on to this position and manage to transfer troops across, then that could be a potential area for the Russian forces to launch attacks across the area right here and into the Kharkiv region. At the same time, we see fighting continuing across the whole front line and also to the north, where the Russian forces continue their attacks to the southwest of Liman Pershi and are fighting in the direction of Sinkivka. And finally, there are two small updates. The first one is that there are further deployments of Wagner forces to Belarus. We see another video of Wagner forces being sent to Belarus. And then finally, there is this quote from the commander of ground forces for the Ukrainian army, Syrsky. He says, and I quote, "Returning Bakhmut is a matter of honor. We have lost many of our brothers there. We simply must recapture it." So this whole thing about Bakhmut, they claim the only point of it is that they have to do it because they claim they would not lose it. They lost it. They've sacrificed a lot to hold on to it. And in the end, the Russian forces have control over it. So they must recapture it because that is what they promised essentially everyone. Zelensky even went to Congress in the United States to say Bakhmut will not fall. And yet the Russian forces still have control over it. So in the end, they are continuously attempting to take control over the city. But although they claim that that is just it, I still firmly believe there is very strategic importance to the city, and I already made a video explaining why that is. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching and have a great day.